The morning sun over Oakwood Heights didn't just shine. It glistened with the kind of polished perfection that only several $1 million in landscaping could buy. Marcus Vance drew in a deep breath of the crisp, eucalyptus-scented air, his sneakers rhythmically slapping against the black asphalt as he maintained a steady, athletic pace. To anyone else, he was just a man in a faded navy hoodie and joggers clearing his head before a long day of work, but in this zip code, every detail was scrutinized through a lens of suspicion. He felt the weight of the neighborhood eyes on his back long before he heard the first rustle of a curtain. Marcus knew the unspoken rules of places like this. You had to look like you belonged, or you became a problem that needed solving. High above the street, tucked behind the pristine white shutters of a sprawling colonial mansion, Brenda Higgins adjusted her silk robe and squinted through the glass. She didn't see a neighbor, she saw an intruder. Her manicured hand gripped her phone with a white-knuckled intensity. She watched the way Marcus's hood covered his hair, the way his steady gaze seemed to linger just a second too long on the perimeter fences. To Brenda, this wasn't exercise, it was reconnaissance. She didn't hesitate. With a practiced flick of her thumb, she dialed the non-emergency line, her voice dropping into that familiar, shaky tone of manufactured peril. She told the dispatcher about a suspicious individual, a man who looked out of place, someone lurking near the properties. She made sure to emphasize that he looked disheveled, a word she used as a polite substitute for unwanted. Down on the street, the peaceful silence of the morning was shattered by the sharp, aggressive chirp of a police siren. Marcus didn't even have to look back to know the lights were flashing red and blue. He slowed his pace to a walk, his heart rate spiking not from the run, but from a weary sense of inevitability. A black and white cruiser swerved sharply toward the curb, cutting off his path and forcing him to stop dead in his tracks. The door swung open with a heavy thud, and Officer Derek Miller stepped out. He didn't lead with a greeting. He led with his hand resting firmly on his holster, his chest puffed out to highlight the silver badge that seemed to be the only thing giving him a sense of identity. Miller's eyes raked over Marcus with an immediate, searing contempt. He didn't see a citizen. He saw a career opportunity, a way to exert the kind of dominance he felt he was owed by the world. He barked out a demand for identification, his voice harsh and grating against the quiet suburban backdrop. Marcus stood his ground, keeping his hands visible and his voice low and level. He explained that he was just out for a morning run and didn't carry his wallet in his joggers, but he offered his name and his address just 3 blocks away. Miller let out a short, jagged laugh that sounded more like a bark of derision. He stepped closer, invading Marcus's personal space until the smell of stale coffee and cheap tobacco on his breath was unavoidable. The officer's lip curled into a sneer as he looked toward the multi-million-dollar homes lining the street. He told Marcus that people like him didn't live in Oakwood Heights. They were the ones hired to scrub the floors or clip the hedges. The insult was intentional, a sharp blade meant to draw blood, but Marcus didn't flinch. He simply repeated that he lived here. The calm in Marcus's eyes only seemed to enrage Miller further, stripping away the officer's facade of professional duty and revealing the raw, unchecked prejudice underneath. Miller snapped, ordering Marcus to turn around and put his hands on the hood of the car. When Marcus tried to explain that he had a phone in his pocket and could call someone to verify his residency, Miller didn't want to hear it. He saw the movement as a threat, or perhaps he just saw it as an excuse to finally get physical. In one violent, blurred motion, Miller grabbed Marcus's arm and slammed him face first against the hot metal of the cruiser's hood. The air rushed out of Marcus's lungs as the cold steel of handcuffs ratcheted shut around his wrists, the metal biting deep into his skin. From the corner of his eye, Marcus saw the white shutters of the colonial mansion twitch. Brenda Higgins was standing on her porch now, a smug, satisfied smile playing on her lips as she watched the scene unfold. To her, the world was being put back in its proper order, and Officer Miller was the hero of her distorted narrative. Marcus felt the sting of the injustice, but as he felt the officer's heavy hand pressing his head down against the car, he didn't feel fear. He felt a cold, calculated clarity. The storm had begun, and Officer Miller had no idea who he had just invited into the center of it. The sweat cooling on Marcus's forehead felt like ice against the heated metal of the patrol car, but his mind was miles away, drifting back 15 years to a day filled with the scent of floor wax and cheap carnations. He could still see his father, Elias, standing in the back of the auditorium, his postman's uniform pressed so sharply the creases looked like they could draw blood. That day, Marcus had stood on a stage at the FBI Academy, his fingers trembling slightly as he accepted the award for top of class. He remembered the weight of the brass trophy and the way his father's eyes had welled up with a pride so thick it was almost tangible. Afterward, leaning against their dented family sedan, Elias had gripped Marcus's shoulder with a hand roughened by decades of sorting mail. He told Marcus that the world wouldn't see the badge first, they would see his skin, and they would see a target. He told him that his real shield wouldn't be the one he carried in his pocket, but the iron will he carried in his soul. Marcus had promised then to never let the world break that internal shield, no matter how hard it hammered against him. While Marcus was building a life of service, Derek Miller was building a cage of resentment. In a drafty, fluorescent-lit hallway of a state testing facility, a younger Miller had sat staring at a failing grade on his state police entrance exam. The examiner's notes were brutal, citing deep-seated aggression issues and an inability to follow de-escalation protocols. Miller hadn't seen it as a personal failure, he saw it as a conspiracy. He watched other candidates, people he deemed less worthy, walk past him with celebratory smiles. That bitterness had curdled over the years, turning into a toxic need for control. When he finally landed a job at a local precinct, he didn't view it as a way to protect the community. He viewed that uniform as a license to finally be the one who did the breaking. He specialized in the small-town power trip, finding his greatest joy in the moments where he could make someone important feel small, or someone different feel hunted. The flashback shifted again, sharper and more painful. Marcus remembered the undercover operation in El Paso, the weeks spent in the shadows of a cartel's warehouse where one wrong word meant a shallow grave. He had survived because he was a master of observation, a man who could read a room before he even entered it. But the hardest struggle wasn't the work, it was the homecoming. After his wife, Elena, was taken in a tragic hit and run, Marcus had looked at his young daughter and realized he couldn't keep living on the edge of a knife. He had moved to Oakwood Heights for the silence, for the gates that promised safety, and for the peace his father had never been able to afford. He worked twice as hard, saved every penny from his hazardous duty pay, and ignored the cold stares from neighbors like Brenda Higgins just to ensure his daughter could wake up to the sound of birds instead of sirens. The jarring sound of Miller's boots scuffing the pavement snapped Marcus back to the present. The heat of the morning sun was intensifying, and the humiliation was becoming a physical weight. Miller reached into the pocket of Marcus's joggers, his fingers fumbling until he pulled out a small, heavy black key fob with an encrypted titanium casing. Miller held it up like it was a piece of stolen jewelry, a triumphant, ugly smirk spreading across his face. He told Marcus that this was the smoking gun, claiming that a guy in a hoodie didn't own a car that required a high-end encrypted fob. He tossed the device onto the asphalt, and Marcus watched in slow motion as the casing hit the ground, a hairline crack snaking across the small digital screen. The tension escalated as Miller leaned back against the car, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at Marcus with a look of pure, unadulterated smugness, telling him that his little fantasy of living in a place like this was over. He whispered that he was going to make sure the system swallowed him whole this time. Marcus remained silent, but inside, the iron shield his father talked about was glowing white-hot. He wasn't just a man on a sidewalk anymore. He was a hunter who had just watched his prey walk directly into a trap. The past and the present were colliding, and the hidden truths Marcus carried were about to become Officer Miller's worst nightmare. The atmosphere in Oakwood Heights had curdled from suburban quiet into something thick and suffocating. Officer Miller wasn't just conducting a stop anymore, he was putting on a performance. He grabbed the collar of Marcus's hoodie, twisting the fabric until it strained against Marcus's throat, and forced him toward the rear of the patrol car. Every movement was jagged and unnecessarily violent, designed to strip away any shred of dignity Marcus had left. Miller began a systematic, aggressive pat-down, his hands slapping against Marcus's ribs and legs with enough force to leave bruises. He reached into Marcus's pockets and pulled out a simple house key and a folded $10 bill, tossing them onto the pavement with a look of utter disgust. He told Marcus that this was the end of the line for his little trespassing excursion, his voice dripping with a sneering, self-important authority. Marcus felt the isolation of the moment like a physical coldness, despite the rising morning heat. He looked down the street and saw several neighbors standing on their manicured lawns. They weren't coming to help. Some were checking their watches, annoyed by the minor traffic delay, while others held up their smartphones, capturing the drama for their social media feeds. To them, Marcus was already guilty. The handcuffs were all the proof they needed. In their eyes, the man in the hoodie was the intruder, and the man with the badge was the protector. No one questioned the lack of a crime, and no one spoke up as Miller tightened the cuffs another notch, the ratcheting sound echoing like a death knell in the silent street. Just as the tension reached a boiling point, a second patrol car pulled up, its tires crunching softly on the gravel. Officer Sarah Jenkins stepped out, a rookie whose uniform still had the sharp creases of someone who believed in the handbook. She walked toward the scene, her eyes darting between Miller's aggressive posture and Marcus's calm, stoic expression. She smelled the expensive lily-of-the-valley perfume of Brenda Higgins before she saw the woman herself. Brenda had finally left her porch, sashaying across the street with a chilled glass of lemonade in one hand and a look of triumphant glee on her face. She stopped next to Miller, purposely avoiding Marcus's gaze as if he were an inanimate object, and thanked the officer for finally taking out the trash. She suggested, with a sharp, high-pitched laugh, that Marcus was probably the one responsible for the missing Amazon packages on the next block. Miller grinned at the support, feeling the rush of being the community hero. He looked at Jenkins and told her to call for a tow truck, even though there was no vehicle to tow. He wanted to maximize the spectacle, to make sure every neighbor saw Marcus being thoroughly dismantled. Jenkins hesitated, her hand hovering over her radio. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw the way he wasn't begging or shouting. He was observing. Marcus caught her eye and spoke in a voice that was eerily steady. He asked her to check the serial number on the key fob lying in the street, telling her it would clarify everything. Before she could move, Miller barked at him to shut his mouth, telling Marcus that criminals didn't get to give orders. Miller leaned in close to Marcus's ear, his voice a low, toxic hiss. He told Marcus that he was going to make it his personal mission to find out where he worked so he could call his boss and make sure he was fired before the sun went down. He called Marcus nothing, a stain on a neighborhood that honest, hardworking people like Brenda paid good money to keep clean. Marcus felt the weight of the injustice pressing down on him, but he didn't break. He looked past Miller at the rookie, Sarah Jenkins, who was now standing silently, her face a mask of internal conflict. She was a silent ally who knew the protocol was being shredded, yet she remained paralyzed by the unwritten code of the badge. Marcus realized then that he was completely alone in this fight, surrounded by people who had decided his worth before he ever opened his mouth. The heavy silence that followed Officer Miller's threats was suddenly broken by the low, rhythmic hum of a high-performance engine. A jet-black SUV with deep-tinted windows rounded the corner, its presence commanding and out of place among the pastel-colored mansions. It slowed to a crawl before stopping directly behind Miller's cruiser. The passenger door opened, and a man in a sharp, slate-gray suit stepped out, his eyes shielded by aviator sunglasses. Behind him, another man followed, both carrying themselves with a rigid, military-grade posture that made Miller's swagger look like a cheap imitation. Brenda Higgins perked up, clutching her lemonade glass tighter, whispering to a neighbor that the private security she'd been demanding must have finally arrived to haul the thug away. Miller, sensing an audience of his peers, straightened his duty belt and put on a show of authority. He waved at the men in suits, calling out that he had the situation under control and that he'd already caught the perpetrator. He expected a nod of approval, perhaps a handshake from fellow law enforcement. But as the men approached, they didn't look at Miller. Their eyes were locked on the man in handcuffs. One of the men, an agent named David whom Marcus had mentored for 5 years, stopped just feet away. His jaw tightened as he looked at the cracked key fob on the ground and then at the bruises blooming on Marcus's wrists. David reached for his own badge, ready to end the charade and tear Miller's world apart right there on the sidewalk. For a split second, Marcus felt the temptation to let it happen. He could see the headlines, hear the apologies, and watch the color drain from Brenda's face as the truth came out. But then he looked at Miller. He saw the pride in the officer's eyes, the absolute certainty that he was untouchable because of the uniform he wore. If Marcus revealed himself now, Miller would be disciplined, maybe suspended, but he wouldn't be stopped. He would just find a new victim tomorrow. Marcus made a split-second decision. As David's hand moved to his lapel, Marcus caught his eye. It was a look they had practiced in 100 tactical drills, the abort signal. It was a silent command to stand down, to let the play continue. David froze, his confusion visible for only a heartbeat before he masked it with professional indifference. He turned back to his partner, muttered something about having the wrong address, and climbed back into the SUV. Miller let out a loud, mocking laugh as the vehicle pulled away, telling Marcus that even the big boys didn't want anything to do with a loser like him. To everyone watching, Marcus had just lost his last hope. Brenda cheered from the sidewalk, and even the rookie, Sarah Jenkins, looked down at her boots, feeling a wave of disappointment that the truth she had hoped for wasn't coming. But inside the patrol car, Marcus's entire mindset shifted. He was no longer a victim of a bad cop, he was an operative in the middle of a sting. He stopped resisting the pressure of the handcuffs and leaned his head back against the seat, his breathing becoming slow and deliberate. He began to play the long game. He wasn't going to just defend himself, he was going to document a crime. He looked through the glass at Miller, who was busy taking a victory lap by chatting with Brenda. Marcus didn't feel anger anymore, he felt focus. He realized that by allowing Miller to take him to the precinct, he would force the officer to put his lies in writing. He would force the system to document its own rot. Miller walked back to the driver's side door, leaning in with a smug, tobacco-stained grin. He told Marcus that they were going for a little ride down to the station where they had a special cell waiting for people who thought they were above the law. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply looked Miller in the eyes and asked him if he was sure he wanted to proceed with the arrest. Miller scoffed, asking if that was a threat. Marcus shook his head slowly, a cold, terrifyingly calm smile touching his lips. He told Miller to make sure he wrote every detail in the official report, the stop, the search, and especially the part where he resisted. Miller slammed the door shut, unaware that he had just signed the warrant for his own professional execution. The fluorescent lights of the precinct hummed with a sterile, buzzing energy that seemed to vibrate against the cinderblock walls. Marcus Vance sat on a metal bench, his back straight despite the handcuffs still biting into his wrists. He watched through the reinforced glass as Officer Derek Miller swaggered through the bullpen, his chest puffed out like a peacock in a polyester uniform. Miller was in high spirits, laughing loudly with a group of veteran officers, regaling them with a twisted version of the morning's events. He mimicked Marcus's voice, exaggerating it into a cartoonish caricature of a thug, drawing bellows of laughter from his colleagues. To Miller, this was a victory lap. He had successfully removed a threat from his pristine neighborhood, and he felt untouchable. In the corner of the room, Miller sat down at his desk, the keys on his keyboard clicking with a frantic, self-righteous rhythm. He was busy drafting the official incident report, his fingers flying as he wove a tapestry of lies. He wrote that Marcus had been aggressive, that he had resisted arrest, and that he had made verbal threats against Officer Miller's life. He described the tactical necessity of slamming Marcus against the car, framing his own brutality as a heroic act of self-defense. Every few minutes, he would look over at the holding cell and wink, a cruel, mocking gesture that said, "I can make the world believe whatever I want." Behind the scenes, the gears of a much larger machine were beginning to turn. In a private, soundproof office at the back of the precinct, the chief of police sat frozen, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Across from him sat a man in a nondescript charcoal suit, the regional director of the FBI. The director didn't scream or pound the desk. His voice was a low, terrifyingly calm whisper. He explained that one of his top special agents, a man who had taken down international cartels, was currently sitting in a holding cell because one of the chief's officers couldn't handle the sight of a black man jogging. The director's instructions were simple: do not intervene yet. Let Miller finish his report. Let him sign his name to the perjury. We want him to dig the hole so deep there's no way out. Marcus was eventually granted his one phone call. Instead of a frantic plea to a lawyer, he spoke in short, coded sentences to the Bureau's technical department. He requested a complete, digital blackout on his public profile for the next 24 hours. He wanted every database Miller might check to show a blank screen or a restricted flag, further baiting the trap. He knew Miller's arrogance would lead him to believe Marcus was just another, untraceable, nobody with a criminal record that had been cleared by a technicality. Throughout the afternoon, Marcus observed Sarah Jenkins, the rookie officer. She was the only one not laughing at Miller's jokes. She sat at her desk, her eyes fixed on the cracked key fob that had been logged into evidence. She knew the protocol for searching a suspect hadn't been followed, and she had seen the look in Marcus's eyes, a look that didn't belong to a criminal. She saw Miller delete a portion of his body cam footage when he thought no one was looking, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her wide, panicked eyes. She was witnessing a crime, and the weight of the blue wall of silence felt like a mountain on her chest. By evening, Miller was done. He printed the report, signed it with a flourish, and tossed it into the completed tray with a satisfied smirk. He grabbed his jacket, telling his buddies he was headed home to celebrate his Community Hero nomination for the upcoming gala. He walked past Marcus's cell one last time, rapping his knuckles against the bars. He told Marcus to get comfortable, because by the time the judge saw this report, he'd be lucky to see the sun again before his daughter turned 30. Marcus didn't respond. He just watched Miller walk away, his mind already 3 moves ahead. The trap was set, the evidence was signed, and the countdown to the gala had begun. The Oakwood Heights Country Club was a fortress of glass and mahogany, smelling of expensive lilies and the sharp, citrus tang of gin martinis. It was the night of the annual Safety and Community Gala, an event where the elite gathered to congratulate themselves on the thickness of their walls. Crystal chandeliers cast a shimmering, fractured light over the ballroom, reflecting off the heavy diamond necklaces and gold watches of guests who moved with the effortless grace of the untouchable. At the center of it all stood Officer Derek Miller. He had traded his polyester patrol blues for a crisp dress uniform, his brass buttons polished to a mirror shine. He held a crystal tumbler in one hand, leaning against a marble pillar as a circle of wealthy donors hung on his every word. He was regaling them with the story of the dangerous vagrant he had apprehended just days prior, painting himself as the thin blue line protecting their manicured lawns from the chaos of the outside world. Brenda Higgins was never far from his side, her high-pitched, melodic laugh cutting through the low hum of conversation. She wore a gown of emerald silk that probably cost more than a teacher's yearly salary, and she moved through the room like a queen mother. Every time a newcomer joined their circle, she would tap Miller's arm with a French manicured nail and tell them how this brave man had saved their neighborhood from a suspicious character who was almost certainly casing their homes. She spoke with a breathless, performative fear, checking her Cartier watch as if the very passage of time was a luxury she owned. To Brenda and the rest of the room, Miller wasn't just a cop. He was a gatekeeper, a man who understood that safety was often just a polite word for exclusion. The atmosphere shifted when the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A silence began to ripple outward from the entrance, like a stone dropped into a still pond. Marcus Vance walked in, but he was no longer the man in the faded navy hoodie. He wore a navy blue suit that was so perfectly tailored it seemed to move like a second skin, his white shirt crisp and stark against his complexion. He didn't slouch, he moved with a slow, predatory confidence that commanded the air around him. Behind him, 4 men in dark suits and earpieces followed in a diamond formation, their faces like stone. The guests whispered behind their hands, confused by the sudden arrival of this commanding stranger. Brenda was the first to break the spell. She squinted, her eyes narrowing as she recognized the face from the sidewalk. She let out a sharp, indignant gasp that drew the attention of the entire room. She marched toward Marcus, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. She didn't look him in the eye, she looked at his chest, snapping her fingers as if he were a waiter who had forgotten her drink order. She demanded to know how a criminal like him had bypassed security, her voice rising to a shrill, entitled peak. She turned to the room, shouting that this was exactly why they needed more men like Miller, to keep the trash from infiltrating their private celebrations. Miller followed close behind her, his hand instinctively dropping to where his holster would be on his work belt. He let out a loud, mocking whistle, telling Marcus that he had a lot of nerve showing up at a place where he didn't even belong in the parking lot. He told the guests that Marcus was probably there to steal the silverware, laughing as he stepped into Marcus's personal space. He leaned in, his voice a low, toxic growl, telling Marcus that he was going to enjoy putting the cuffs back on him, and this time, he'd make sure they were tight enough to stop the blood flow. He was so blinded by his own arrogance, so fueled by the cheers of the wealthy crowd, that he didn't notice the way the chief of police was standing in the shadows, his face as pale as a ghost. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't argue with Brenda, and he didn't look at the finger she was shaking in his face. He simply waited. He let the insults hang in the air until the silence in the room became heavy and uncomfortable. He looked past Miller toward the podium at the front of the room, where the Community Hero Award sat waiting under a velvet cloth. With a slow, deliberate movement, Marcus reached into his inner coat pocket. Miller lunged forward, shouting for everyone to get back, convinced he was about to witness a desperate man pull a weapon. Instead, Marcus pulled out a leather bifold, snapping it open with a sound like a gunshot. The gold badge of a federal agent caught the light of the chandeliers, sending a blinding glint directly into Miller's eyes. Marcus's voice shifted, losing its quiet patience and taking on a tone of absolute, unbreakable command. He told the room that the gala was over, and then he looked Miller dead in the eye and told him it was time to talk about the report he had signed. The golden glint of the badge seemed to suck the air right out of the ballroom. Derek Miller's sneer didn't just fade, it disintegrated, leaving behind a face that was suddenly, pathetically pale. The crystal glass in his hand trembled, the ice cubes rattling against the sides like a frantic heartbeat. Marcus Vance stepped forward, his presence expanding until he seemed to tower over the decorated officer. He didn't just look like a man in a suit anymore, he looked like the embodiment of every consequence Miller had spent a career trying to outrun. Marcus reached out and took the microphone from the podium, the feedback let out a sharp, metallic whine that made the wealthy donors wince and cover their ears. Marcus's voice didn't need to be loud to be devastating. He spoke with a rhythmic, icy precision, telling the audience exactly who he was. Special Agent in Charge Marcus Vance of the FBI's Public Corruption Division. A collective gasp rippled through the room, sounding like a sudden gust of wind through dry leaves. Brenda Higgins, who had been seconds away from calling for security, suddenly looked as if she wanted to melt into the emerald silk of her gown. She took a stumbling step back, her French manicured hand flying to her throat as she realized the vagrant she had been mocking was the most powerful man in the room. Marcus signaled to a technician in the back, and the massive projector screen behind the stage flickered to life. The room went pitch black for a second before it was filled with the grainy, wide-angle perspective of Miller's own body cam. The guests watched in horrific silence as the footage showed Marcus jogging peacefully, followed by Miller's unprovoked aggression. They heard Miller's voice, the same voice that had been charming them with martinis minutes ago, growling racial slurs and mocking Marcus's right to exist in their neighborhood. Then, the screen split, showing a side-by-side comparison of the actual footage against the typed report Miller had signed at the precinct. Every lie was highlighted in glowing red text. The fabricated assault, the non-existent resistance, the planted suspicion. The silence that followed was deafening. Miller tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but only a dry, pathetic wheeze came out. He looked to the chief of police for help, but the chief was already walking toward the stage with two internal affairs officers. Marcus turned the microphone toward Miller, asking him if he had any more brave stories to tell the donors before he was processed. Miller's knees buckled, and he actually reached out to grab the edge of a table for support, knocking over a tray of champagne flutes that shattered across the marble floor with a sound like falling diamonds. The rookie, Sarah Jenkins, stepped out from the wings of the stage. She wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. She walked straight up to Miller and unclipped the heavy ring of keys from his belt, her face set in a mask of grim satisfaction. She looked him dead in the eye and told him that she had turned over her personal recordings to the Bureau an hour ago. Every admission of profiling, every joke about violation of civil rights he had ever uttered in the locker room. The blue wall hadn't just cracked, it had collapsed on top of him. Marcus stepped down from the podium, walking slowly toward the trembling officer. He told Miller that he had been right about one thing back on that sidewalk. People like Marcus didn't belong in Miller's version of the world. Because in Miller's world, the badge was a shield for bullies, but in Marcus's world, the badge was a weight that required a spine of steel to carry. He watched as the internal affairs officers forced Miller's arms behind his back, the metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the silent ballroom. The same sound Miller had used to humiliate Marcus just days before. Brenda Higgins tried to slip away toward the coat check, her head down, but Marcus's voice stopped her in her tracks without him even turning around. He addressed her by name, loud enough for every donor in the room to hear, informing her that a federal subpoena had been issued for the Oakwood Heights Law records. He told her that her neighborhood watch was about to become the subject of a federal housing discrimination lawsuit that would make her current net worth look like pocket change. Brenda's glass of lemonade slipped from her hand, splashing across her expensive shoes, as the reality of her total social and financial ruin began to set in. Marcus stood at the center of the room, the hero of a story they never expected, delivering the final killing blow not with a fist, but with the cold, hard truth of the law. The heavy oak doors of the country club closed behind the disgraced Derek Miller, but the echo of his metal heels on the marble floor lingered like a stain. Outside, the night air was cooling, and the chaotic flashing of the red and blue police lights felt different this time. They weren't predatory, they were corrective. Miller was ushered into the back of a transport van, his head bowed to avoid the cameras of the local news crews that had swarmed the entrance. He had traded his dress uniform for the cold, anonymous weight of steel shackles. The career he had built on a foundation of intimidation had collapsed in a single evening, leaving him with nothing but a looming federal indictment and the bitter realization that the man he had tried to break was the one who had finally ended him. A few yards away, Brenda Higgins stood by the valet stand, her emerald gown catching the wind. She looked smaller than she had an hour ago, her face haggard under the harsh glare of the streetlights. Her phone buzzed incessantly in her clutch, likely the WA board members calling to distance themselves from her before the federal lawsuit hit the morning papers. Marcus Vance walked past her toward his own vehicle. He didn't gloat, and he didn't stop to enjoy her misery. When Brenda tried to stammer out a hollow, terrified apology, Marcus simply looked through her as if she were made of glass. He told her that apologies were for mistakes, but what she had done was a choice. He walked away, leaving her standing alone in the shadows of the club she no longer truly owned. 5 years passed with the quiet, inevitable steady beat of true justice. The Oakwood Heights incident became a landmark case in federal law, a cautionary tale taught at every police academy in the country. Marcus Vance had moved on from field work, taking a senior position at the Department of Justice where he oversaw a national task force on civil rights. He used the substantial settlement he won from the city and the WA not for luxury, but for legacy. On the corner of a bustling street in the neighborhood where he had grown up, a new glass and brick building stood proud. The Elias Vance Community Center was more than just a gym or a library. It was a sanctuary where young men and women were taught that their identity was their greatest strength, not a reason to hide. One brisk autumn morning, Marcus stood on the sidewalk outside the center, watching a group of teenagers head inside for a mentorship workshop. He felt a familiar presence and turned to see Sarah Jenkins, now a captain with her own precinct, walking toward him with a folder in her hand. She had become the leader the city actually needed, a woman who had rebuilt her department from the ashes of Miller's corruption. They shared a quiet nod of mutual respect, a silent acknowledgement of the bridge they had built together. Sarah told him that the neighborhood was changing, not because of gates and cameras, but because people finally felt they could breathe again. In a different part of the state, behind the high, gray walls of a federal correctional facility, a man with thinning hair and a tired, hunched posture pushed a heavy yellow mop bucket down a long, sterile corridor. Derek Miller didn't look like a hero anymore. He didn't even look like a cop. He wore a drab orange jumpsuit, his eyes fixed on the dirty water as he scrubbed the floors he used to think were beneath him. Every time a guard walked past, he had to stop and stand against the wall, eyes down, waiting for permission to move. The very janitorial life he had used as a weapon of shame against Marcus had become his daily reality. Karma hadn't just visited him, it had moved in. Marcus climbed into his car, glancing at a framed photo on his dashboard of his father, Elias, in his old postman's uniform. He thought about the iron shield his father had told him to carry within his soul. The world would always have its Millers and its Brendas, people who judged a book by its cover because they were too afraid to read the pages. But Marcus had proven that while a badge can be stripped away and a mansion can be lost, integrity is a currency that never devalues. As he pulled away from the center, he realized that the greatest lesson wasn't about the power of the reveal or the thrill of the win. It was about the fact that true character isn't what you do when the world is watching, but who you remain when they try to tell you that you are nothing. Kindness, he realized, was the ultimate power, and justice was simply the world catching up to the truth.